to all of you. Textbook in History for Class 12. Themes in Indian History Part 1. Theme 3. Kinship, Caste and Class, Early Societies, the two 600 BCE to 600 CE. Audiobook. Take a look at Figure 3.1, a terracotta sculpture depicting a scene from the Mahabharata, West Bengal, 17th century. In the previous chapter, we saw that there were several changes in economic and political life between 600 BC and 600 CE. Some of these changes influenced societies as well. For instance, the extension of agriculture into forested area transformed the lives of forest dwellers. Craft specialists often emerged as distinct social groups. The unequal distributions of wealth sharpened social differences. Historians often use the textual traditions to understand these processes. Some texts lay down norms of social behavior, others describe and occasionally comment on a wide range of social situations and practices. We can also catch a glimpse of some social actors from inscriptions. As we will see, each text and inscription was written from the perspective of specific social categories. So we need to keep in mind who composed what and for whom. We also need to consider the language used and the ways in which the text circulated. Used carefully text allow us to piece together attitudes and practices that shaped social histories. In focusing on the Mahabharata, a colossal epic running in its present form into over 1 lakh verses with depictions of a wide range of social categories and situations. We draw on one of the richest texts of the subcontinent. It was composed over the period of about 1000 years. See, 500 BCE onwards, and some of the stories it contains may have been in circulation even earlier. The central story is about two sets of varying cousins. The text also contains sections laying down norms of behavior for various social groups. Occasionally, though not always, the principal characters seem to follow these norms. What is conformity with norms and deviations from them significantly? Take a look at Figure 3.2, a section of a page from the critical edition. The section printed in large bold letters is part of the main text. The smaller print lists variations in different manuscripts which were carefully catalogued. The critical edition of the Mahabharata, one of the most ambitious projects of scholars, began in 1919 under the leadership of a noted Indian Sanskritist V.S. Sukhthankar. A team comprising dozens of scholars initiated the task of preparing a critical edition of the Mahabharata. What exactly did this involve? Initially, it meant collecting Sanskrit manuscript of the text written in a variety of scripts from different parts of the country. The team worked out a method of comparing verses from each manuscript. Ultimately, they selected the verses that appeared common to most versions and published these in several volumes. Running into over 13,000 pages, the project took 47 years to complete. Two things became apparent. There were several common elements in the Sanskrit versions of the story, evident in manuscripts found all over the subcontinent, from Kashmir and Nepal in the north to Kerala and Tamil Nadu in the south. Also evident were enormous regional variations in the way in which the text had been transmitted over the centuries. These variations were documented in footnotes and appendix to the main text. Taken together, more than half the 13,000 pages are devoted to these variations. In a sense, these variations are reflective of the complex processes that shaped early and later social histories through dialogues between dominant traditions and resilient local ideas and practices. These dialogues are characterized by moments of conflict as well as consensus. Our understanding of these processes is derived primarily from texts written in Sanskrit meant for Brahmanas. When issues of social history were explored for the First time by historians in the 19th and 20th centuries, they tended to take these texts at face value, believing that everything that was laid down in these texts was actually practiced. Subsequently, scholars began studying other traditions. From works in Pali, Prakrit, and Tamil, these studies indicated that the ideas contained in normative Sanskrit text were on the whole recognized as authoritative. They were also questioned and occasionally even rejected. It is important to keep this in mind as we examine how historians reconstruct social histories. Terms for family and kin. Sanskrit texts use the term kula to designate families and jnati for the larger network of kinfolk. The term vamsha is used for lineage. Patrilineal means tracing descent from father to son, grandson, and so on. Maternity is the maternally. Matrilineal is a term used when descent is traced through the mother. Kinship and marriage, many rules and varied practices. Finding out about families. We often take family life for granted. However, you may have noticed that not all families are identical. They vary in terms of numbers of members, their relationship with one another, as well as the kinds of activities they share. Often, people belonging to the same family share food and other resources and live, work, and perform rituals together. Families are usually parts of larger networks of people defined as relatives, or to use a more technical term, kinfolk. While familial ties are often regarded as natural and based on blood, they are defined in many different ways. For instance, some societies regard cousins as begin blood relations, whereas others do not. For early societies, historians can retrieve information about allied families fairly easily. It is, however, far more difficult to reconstruct the familial relationship of ordinary people. Historians also investigate and analyze attitudes towards family and kinship. These are important because they provide an insight into people's thinking. It is likely that some of these ideas would have shaped their actions, just as actions may have led to changes in attitudes. The ideal of patrilineal. Can we identify points when kinship relations changed at one level? The Mahabharata is a story about this. It describes a fight over land and power between two groups of cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, who belonged to a single ruling family. That of the Kurus, a lineage domination one of the Janapadas, chapter 2, map 1. Ultimately, the conflict ended in a battle in which the Pandavas emerged victorious. After that, patrilineal succession was proclaimed. While patrilineal has existed prior to the composition of the epic, the central story of the Mahabharata reinforced the idea that it was valuable. Under patrilineal, sons could claim the resources, including the throne in the case of kings, of their fathers when they later died. Most ruling dynasties, 6th century BC onwards, claimed to follow this system. Although there were variations in practice, sometimes there were no sons. Take a look at map 1, the Kuru, Panchala region and neighboring areas. In some situations, brothers succeed one another, sometimes other kinsmen claimed the throne, and in very expectational circumstances, women such as Prabhavati Gupta, chapter 2, exercised power. The concern with patrilineal was not unique to ruling families. It is evident in mantras, in ritual texts such as the Rig Veda. It is possible that these attitudes were shared by wealthy men and those who claimed high status, including Brahmanas. Source 1, producing fine sons. Here is an excerpt of a mantra from the Rig Veda, which was probably inserted in the text 1000 BCE to be chanted by the priest while conducting the marriage ritual. It is used in many Hindu weddings even today. I free her from here, but not from there. I have bound her firmly there, so that through the grace of Indra, she will have fine sons and be fortunate in her husband's love. Indra was one of the principal deities, a god of valor, warfare, and rain. Here and there refer to the father's and husband's house respectively. In the context of the mantra, discuss the implications of marriage from the point of view of the bride and groom. Are the implications identical or are they are there differences? Why kinfolk quarrel? This is an excerpt from the Adi Parvan, literally the first section of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, describing why conflicts arose amongst the Kauravas and Pandavas. The Kauravas were the sons of Dhritarashtra and the Pandavas were their cousins. Since Dhritarashtra was blind, his younger brother Pandu ascended the throne of Hastinapura. See map 1. However, after the premature death of Pandu, Dhritarashtra became king as the royal princes were still very young. As the princes grew up together, the citizens of Hastinapura began to express their preference for the Pandavas, for they were more capable and virtuous than the Kauravas. This made Duryodhana, the eldest of the Kauravas, jealous. He approached his father and said, "You yourself did not receive the throne, although it fell to you. Because of your defect, if the Pandya receives the patrimony from Pandu, his son will surely inherit it in turn, and so will his son and his. We ourselves, with our sons, shall be excluded from the royal successions and become of slight regarded in the eyes of the world, Lord of the earth." Passages such as these may not have been literally true, but they give us an idea about what those who wrote the text thought. Sometimes, as in this case, they contain conflicting ideas. Read the passage and list the different criteria suggested for becoming king. Of these, how important was birth in a particular family? Which of these criteria seem justified? Are there any that strike you as unjust? Types of marriages. Endogamy refers to marriage within a unit. This could be a kin group, caste, or a group living in the same locality. Exogamy refers to marriage outside the unit. Poly- Polygyny is the practice of a man having several wives. Polyandry is the practice of a woman having several husbands. Rules of marriage. While sons were important for the continuity of the patrilineage, daughters were viewed rather differently within this framework. They had no claims to the resources of the household. At the same time, marrying them into families outside the kin was considered desirable. This system, called exogamy, literally marrying outside, meant that the lives of young girls and women belonging to families that claimed high status were often carefully regulated to ensure that they were married at the right time and to the right person. This gave rise to the belief that Kanyadhana, or the gift of a daughter in marriage, was an important religious duty of the father. With the emergence of new towns, chapter 2, social life became more complex. People from near and far met to buy and sell their products and share ideas in the urban milieu. This may have led to a questioning of earlier beliefs and practices. See also chapter 4. Faced with this challenge, the Brahmanas responded by laying down codes of social behavior in great detail. These were meant to be followed by Brahmanas in particular and the rest of society in general. From 500 BCE, these norms were complied in Sanskrit text known as the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. The most important of such works, the Manusmriti, was compiled between 200 BC and 200 CE. while the Brahmana authors of these texts claimed that their point of view had universal validity and that what they prescribed had to be obeyed by everybody. It is likely that real social relations were more complicated. Besides, given the regional diversity within the subcontinent and the difficulties of communication, the influence of Brahmanas was by no means all pervasive. What is interesting is that the Dharmashastras and Dharmashastras recognized as many as 8 forms of marriage. Of these, the first 4 were considered as good, while the remaining were condemned. It is possible that these were practiced by those who did not accept Brahminical norms. 8 forms of marriage. Here are the first, fourth, fifth, and sixth forms of marriages from the Manusmriti. First, the gift of a doctor after dressing her in costly clothes and honoring her with the presents of jewels to a man learned in the Veda whom the father himself invites. Fourth, the gift of a doctor by the father after he has addressed the couple with the text, "May both of you perform your duties together," and has shown honor to the bridegroom. Fifth, when the bridegroom receives a maiden after having given as much wealth as he can afford to the kinsman and to the bride herself, according to his own will. Sixth, the voluntary union of a maiden and her lover which springs from desire. From each of the forms discussed whether the discussion about the marriages was taken by the bride, the bridegroom, the father of the bride, the father of the bridegroom, any other person. The Gotra of women. One Brahmanical practice evident from 1000 BC onwards was to classify people, especially Brahmanas, in terms of Gotras. Each Gotra was named after a Vedic seed, and all those who belonged to the same Gotra were regarded as his descendants. Two rulers about Gotra were particularly important. Women were expected to give up their father's Gotra and adopt that of their husbands on marriage, and members of the same Gotra could not marry. One way to find out whether this was commonly followed is to consider the names of men and women, which were sometimes derived from Gotra names. These names are available for powerful ruling lineages such as the Shatavahanas who ruled over parts of western India and the Deccan, 2nd century BC, 2nd century CE. Several of their inscriptions have been recovered which allow historians to trace family ties, including marriages, including marriages. Source 4. Names of Shatavahana kings from inscriptions. These are the names of several generations of Shatavahana rulers recovered from inscriptions. Note the uniform title Raja. Also note the following word which ends with the term Putha, a Prakrit word meaning son. The term Gothami Putta means son of Gotami. Names like Gotami and Vashti are feminine forms of Gotama and Vasistha. Vedic seers after whom Gotras were named: Raja Gotami, Putta Siri Shatakani, Raja Visithi Putta, Sami Siri Pulumayi, Raja Gotami Putta, Sami Siri Yana Satakani, Raja Madhari Putta Swami Sakasena, Raja Vasathi Putta Chatarapana Satakani, Raja Hariti Putta Vinhukadha Chutukalana Manda Satakamani, Raja Gotami Putta Siri Vijaya Shatakani. How many Gotami Puttas and how many Vasthi alternative spelling Vasati Puttas are there? Take a look at figure 3.3. The Shatavahana ruler and his wife. This is one of the rare sculptured depictions of a ruler from the wall of a cave donated to Buddhist monks. This sculpture dates to 2nd century BC. Matronymics in the Upanishads. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the earliest Upanishads, say also chapter 4 contains a list of successive generations of teachers and students, many of whom were designated by matronymics. A mother's advice. The Mahabharata describes how when the war between the Kauravas and the Pandavas became almost inevitable, Gandhari made one last appeal to her eldest son Duryodhana. By making peace, you honor your father and me as well as your wishers. It is the wise man in control of his senses who guards his kingdom. Greed and anger drag a man away from his profits. By defeating these two enemies, a king conquers the earth. You will happily enjoy the earth, my son. Along with the wise and heroic Pandavas, there is no good in a war. No law, dharma, and profit artha, let alone happiness, nor is there necessarily victory in the end. Doesn't set your mind on war. Duryodhana did not listen to this advice, won fought and lost the war. Does this passage give you an idea about the way in which mothers were viewed in early Indian societies? Discuss. How are children named today? Are these ways of naming similar to or different from those described in this section? Take a look at figure 3.4. This is almost the earliest sculpture depictions of a scene from the Mahabharata, a terracotta sculpture from the walls of a temple in Achichatra, Uttar Pradesh, 5th century CE. Some of the Shatavahana rulers were polygynous, that is, had more than one wife. An examination of the names of women who married Shatavahana rulers indicates that many of them had names derived from Gotras and such as Gotama and Vasishta. Their fathers' Gotras, they evidently retained these names instead of adopting names derived from their husbands' Gotra names as they were required to do according to the Brahmanical rulers. What is also apparent is that some of these women belonged to the same Gotra. As is obvious, this ran counter to the ideal of exogamy recommended in the Brahmanical text. In fact, it exemplified an alternative practice, that of endogamy or marriage within the kin group, which was and is prevalent amongst several communities in South India. Such marriages amongst kinfolk, such as cousins, ensured a close knit community. It is likely that there were variations in other parts of the subcontinent as well, but as it has not been possible to reconstruct specific details. Were mothers important? We have seen that Shatavahana rulers were identified through matronymic names derived from that of the mother. Although this may suggest that mothers were important, we need to be cautious before we arrive at any conclusion. In the case of the Shatavahanas, we know that succession to the throne was generally patrilineal. Social differences within the beyond the framework of caste. You are probably familiar with the term caste, which refers to a set of hierarchically ordered social categories. The ideal order was laid down in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. Brahmanas claimed that this old order, in which they were ranked first, was divinely ordained, while placing groups classified as Shudras and untouchables at the very bottom of the social order. Positions within the order were supposedly determined by birth, the right occupation. The Dharmashastras and Dharmashastras also contain rules about the ideal occupations of the four categories or varnas. Brahmanas were supposed to study and teach the Vedas, perform sacrifices and get sacrificed performed, and give and receive gifts. Kshatriyas were to engage in warfare, protect people, and administer justice, study the Vedas, get sacrifices performed, and make gifts. The last three occupations were also assigned to the Vaishyas, who were in addition expected to engage in agriculture, pastoralism, and trade. Shudras were assigned only one occupation, that of serving the three higher varnas. The Brahmanas evolved two or three strategies for enforcing these norms. One, as we have just seen, was to assert that the Varna order was of a divine origin. Second, they advised kings to ensure that these norms were followed within their kingdoms. And third, they attempted to persuade people that their status was determined by birth. However, this was not always easy, so prescriptions were often reinforced by stories told in the Mahabharata and other texts. Source 6. A divine order to justify their claims. Brahmanas often cited a verse from a hymn in the Rig Veda known as the Purusha Sukta, describing the sacrifice of Purusha, the primeval man. All the elements of the universe include including the four social categories were supposed to have emanated from his body. The Brahmana was his mouth, of his arms was made the Kshatriya. The things became the Vaishya, of his feet the Shudra was born. Why do you think the Brahmanas quoted the verse frequently? Proper social roles. Here is a story from the Adi Parvam of the Mahabharata. Once Drona, a Brahmana who taught archery to the Kuru princess, was approached by Ekalavya, a forest dwelling Nishada, a hunting community. When Drona, who knew the Dharma, refused to have him as his pupil, Ekalavya returned to the forest, prepared an image of Drona out of clay, and treating it as his teacher, began to practice on his own. In due course, he acquired great skill in archery. One day, the Kuru princess went hunting, and their dog, wandering in the woods, came upon Ekalavya. When the dog smelled the dark Nishada wrapped in black deer skin, his body caked with dirt, it began to bark. Annoyed, Ekalavya shot 7 arrows into his mouth. When the dog returned to the Pandavas, they were amazed at his superb display of archery. They tracked down Ekalavya, who introduced himself as a pupil of Drona. Drona had once told his favorite student Arjuna that he would be unrevealed amongst his peoples. Arjuna now reminded Drona about his. Drona approached Ekalavya, who immediately acknowledged and honored him as his teacher. When Drona demanded his right thumb as his fee, Ekalavya unhesitatingly cut it off and offered it. But thereafter, when he shot within his remaining fingers, he was no longer as fast as he had been before. Thus Drona kept his word. No one was better than Arjuna. What message do you think the story was meant to convey to the Nishadas? What message would it convey to Kshatriyas? Do you think that Drona, as a Brahmana, was acting according to the Dharma Shastras when he was teaching archery? Non Kshatriya kings. According to the Shastras, only Kshatriyas could be kings. However, several important ruling lineages probably had different origins. The social background of the Mauryas, who ruled over a large empire, had been hotly debated. While later Buddhist texts suggested they were Kshatriyas, Brahmanical texts described them as being of low origin. The Shungas and Kanvas, the immediate successors of the Mauryas, were Brahmanas. In fact, political power was efficiently open to anyone who could muster support and resources, and rarely depended on birth as a Kshatriya. Other rulers, such as the Shakas, who came from Central Asia, were regarded as Melchas, barbarians or outsiders by the Brahmanas. However, one of the earliest inscriptions in Sanskrit describes how Rudradhamana, the best known Shaka ruler, 2nd century CE, rebuilt Sudarshana Lake chapter 2. Sudarshana Lake chapter 2. This suggests that powerful Melchas were familiar with Sanskrit traditions. It is also interesting that the best known ruler of the Shatavahana dynasty, Gautamiputra Sri Shatakani. Claimed to be both a unique Brahmana Ekabhamana and a destroyer of the pride of Kshatriyas. He also claimed to have ensured that there was no intermarriage amongst members of the four Varnas. At the same time, he entered into a marriage alliance with the king of Rudradaman. As you can see from this example, integration within the framework of caste was often a complicated process. The Shatavahanas claimed to be Brahmanas, whereas according to the Brahmanas king's oath to have been Kshatriyas, they claimed to uphold the fourfold Varna order but entered into marriage alliances with people who were supposed to be excluded from the system. And as we have seen, they practiced endogamy instead of the exogamous system recommended in the Brahmanical texts. Jatis and social mobility. These complexities are reflected in another term used in text to refer to social categories, jati. In Brahmanical theory, jati like varna was based on birth. However, while the number of varnas was fixed at 4, there was no restriction on the number of jatis. In fact, whenever Brahmanical authorities encountered new groups, for instance, people living in forests such as the Nishadhas, or wanted to assign a name to occupational categories such as the goldsmiths or Swarnakara, which did not easily fit into the fourfold Varna system. They classified them as a jati. Jatis which shared a common occupation or profession were sometimes organized into shrenis or guilds. We seldom come across documents that record the histories of these groups, but there are expectations. One interesting stone inscription, 5th century, found in Mandasar, Madhya Pradesh, records the history of a guild of silk weavers who originally lived in Lata, Gujarat, from where they migrated to Mandasar, then known as Dashapura. It states that they undertook the difficult journey along with their children and kinfolk, as they had heard about the greatness of the local king and wanted to settle in his kingdom. Take a look at figure 3.5. Silver coin depicting a Shaka ruler 4th century CE. The case of the merchants. Sanskrit text and inscriptions used the term vanik to designate merchants, while trade was defined as an occupation for Vaishyas in the Shastras. A more complex situation is evident in plays such as the Michakatika, written by Shudraka, written by Shudraka, 4th century CE. Here, the hero Chandradatta was described as both a Brahmana and a Sartavaha or merchant, and a 5th century inscription describes two brothers who made a donation for the construction of a temple as Kshatriya Vaniks. Do you think the silk weavers were following the occupation laid down for them in the Shastras? The inscription provides a fascinating glimpse of complex social processes and provides insights into the nature of guilds or shrenis. Although membership was based on a shared craft specialization, some members adopted other occupation. It also indicates profession. They collectively decided to invest their wealth earned through their craft to construct a splendid temple in honor of the sun god. What the silk weavers did. Here is an excerpt from the inscription, which is in Sanskrit. Some are intentionally attached to music so pleasing to the ear. Others begin proud of the authorship of 100 excellent biographies, are conversant with the wonderful tales. Others filled with humility are absorbed in excellent religious discourses. Some excel in their own religious rites. Likewise, by others whom were self possessed, the science of Vedic astronomy was mastered, and others, warriors in battle, even today, forcibly cause harm to the enemies. Beyond the four Varnas integration, Given the diversity of the subcontinent, there were and always have been population whose social practices were not influenced by Brahmanical ideas. When they figure in Sanskrit texts, they are often described as odd, uncivilized, or even animal like. In some instances, these included forest dwellers for whom hunting and gathering remained an important means of subsistence. Categories such as the Nishadha, to which Ekalavya is supposed to have belonged, are examples of this. Others who were viewed with suspicious suspicion included populations such as nomadic pastoralists who could not be easily accommodated within the framework of settled agriculturists. Sometimes those who spoke non Sanskrit languages were labeled as mlechas or looked down upon. There was nonetheless also a sharing of ideas and beliefs between these people. The nature of relations is evident in some stories in the Mahabharata. A tiger like husband. This is a summary of a story from the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata. The Pandavas had fled into the forest, they were tired and fell asleep. Only Bhima, the second Pandava, renowned for his prowess, was keeping watch. A man eating Rakshasa caught the scent of the Pandavas and sent his sister Hidimba to capture them. She fell in love with Bhima, transformed herself into a lovely maiden, and proposed to him. He refused. Meanwhile, the Rakshaka arrived and challenged Bhima to a wrestling match. Bhima accepted the challenge and killed him. The others woke up hearing the noise. Him, Hidimba introduced herself and declared her love for Bhima. She told Kunti, I have forsaken my friends, my dharma, and my kin. And go, good lady, chosen your tiger like son for my man. Whether you think me a fool or your devoted servant, let me join you, great lady, with your son as my husband. Ultimately, Yudhishthira agreed to the marriage on condition that they would spend the day together but that Bhima would return every night. The couple roamed all over the world during the day. In due course, Hidimba gave birth to a Rakshasa boy named Gatotkacha. Then the mother and son left the Pandavas. Gatotkacha promised to return to the Pandavas whenever they needed him. Some historians suggest that the term Rakshasa is used to describe people whose practices differed from those laid down in Brahmanical texts. Identify the practices described in this passage which seem non Brahmanical. Beyond the four Varnas, subordinate and conflict. While the Brahmanas considered some people as being outside the system, they also developed a sharper social divide by classifying certain social categories as untouchable. This rested on a notion that certain activities, especially those connected with the performance of rituals, were sacred and by extension pure. Those who considered themselves pure avoided taking food from those they designated as untouchable. In sharp contrast to the purity aspect, some activities were regarded as particularly polluting. These included handling corpses and dead animals. Those who performed such tasks, designated as chandalas, were placed at the very bottom of the hatchery. Their touch and in some cases even seeing them was regarded as polluting by those who claimed to be at the top of the social order. Take a look at figure 3.6, depiction of a mendicant seeking alms, stone sculpture Gandhara, 3rd century CE. The Manusmriti laid down the duties of the Chandalas. They had to live outside the village, use discarded utensils, and wear clothes of the dead and ornaments of iron. They could not walk about in villages and cities at night. They had to dispose of the bodies of those who had no relatives and serve as executioners. Much later, the Chinese Buddhist monk Faxian 5th century, wrote that untouchables had to sound a clapper in the streets so that people could avoid seeing them. Another Chinese pilgrim, Zhongzhang 7th century, observed that executioners and scavengers were forced to live outside the city. By examining non Brahmanical texts which depict the lives of Chandalas, historians have tried to find out whether Chandalas accepted the life of degradation prescribed in the Shastras. Sometimes these depictions correspond with those in the Brahmanical text, but occasionally there are hints of different social realities. Source 10. The Bodhisattva as a Chandala. Did Chandalas resist the attempts to push them to the bottom of the social order? Read the story, which is part of the Matanga Jataka, a Pali text where the Bodhisattva, the Buddha in a previous birth, is identified as a Chandala. Once the Bodhisattva was born outside the city of Banaras as a Chandala's son and named Matanga. One day, when he had gone to the city on some work, he encountered Ditha Mangalika, the daughter of a merchant. When she saw him, she exclaimed, I have seen something inauspicious, and washed her eyes. The angry hangers on them beat him up. In protest, he went and lay down at the door of her father's house. On the seventh day, they brought out the girl and gave her to him. She carried the starving Mathanga back to the Chandala settlement. Once he returned home, he decided to renounce the world. After attaining spiritual powers, he returned to Banaras and married her. A son named Madhavya Kumara was born to him. He learned the three Vedas as he grew up and began to provide food to 16,000 Brahmanas every day. One day, Mathanga, dressed in rags with a clay alms bowl in his hand, arrived at his son's doorstep and begged for food. Mandavya replied that he looked like an outcast and was unworthy of alms. The food was meant for the Brahmanas, Matanga said. Those who are proud of their birth and are ignorant do not deserve gifts. On the contrary, those who are free from vices are worthy of offering. Mandavya lost his temper and asked his servants to throw the man out. Matanga rose in the air and disappeared when Ditta Mangalika learned about the incident. She followed Matanga and begged his forgiveness. He asked her to take a bit of the leftover from his bowl and give it to Mandavya and the Brahmanas. Identify elements in the story that suggest that it was written from the perspective of Matanga. Discuss which of the sources mentioned in this section suggest that people followed the occupation laid down by Brahmanas, which sources suggest other possibilities. Draupadi's version. Draupadi is supposed to have asked Yudhishthira whether he had lost himself before staking her. Two contrary opinions were expressed in response to his question. One, that even if Yudhishthira had lost himself earlier, his wife remained under his control so he could stake her. 2. That an unfree man, as Yudhishthira was when he had lost himself, could not stake another person. The matter remained unresolved ultimately. Dhritarashtra restored to the Pandavas and Draupadi their personal freedom. Do you think that this episode suggests that wives could be treated as the property of their husbands? Beyond birth, resources, and status. If you recall the economic relations discussed in Chapter 2, you will realize that slaves, landless agricultural laborers, hunters, fisherfolk, pastoralists, peasants, village headmen, craftspersons, merchants, and kings emerged as social actors in different parts of the subcontinent. Their social positions were often shaped by their access to economic resources. Here we will examine the social implications of SS2 resources in certain specific situations. Gendered SS2 property. Consider first a critical episode in the Mahabharata during the course of the long run rivalry between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Duryodhana invited Yudhishthira to a game of dice. The latter, who was deceived by his rival, staked his gold, elephants, chariots, slaves, army, treasury, kingdom, the property of his subjects, his brothers, and finally himself, and lost all. Then he staked their common wife Draupadi and lost her too. Issues of ownership foregrounded in stories such as this one, Source 11, also figure in the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras. According to the Manusmriti, the paternal estate was to be divided equally among us sons after the death of the parents, with a special share for the eldest. Women could not claim a share of these resources. However, women were allowed to retain the gifts they received on the occasion of their marriage as Stridhana, literally a woman's wealth. This could be inherited by their children without the husband having any claim on it. At the same time, the Manusmriti warned women against hoarding family property or even their own valuables without the husband's permission. You have read about wealthy women such as the Vakataka Queen Prabhavati Gupta, Chapter 2. However, cumulative evidence, both epigraphic and textual, suggests that while upper class women may have had access to resources, land, cattle, and money were generally controlled by men. In other words, social differences between men and women were sharpened because of the differences in access to resources. How could men and women acquire wealth? For men, the Manusmriti declares there are seven means of acquiring wealth: inheritance, finding, purchase, conquest, investment, work, and acceptance of gifts from the good people. For women, there are six means of acquiring wealth: what was given in front of the fire, marriage, or the bridal procession, or as a token of affection, and what she got from her brother, mother, or father. She could also acquire wealth through any subsequent gift and whatever her affectionate husband might give her. Compare and contrast the ways in which men and women could acquire wealth. Varna and access to property. According to the Brahmanical text and their criterion, apart from gender, for regulating access to wealth was Varna. As we saw earlier, the only occupation prescribed for Shudras was servitude, while a variety of occupations were listed for men of the first three Varnas. If these provisions were actually implemented, the wealthiest men would have been the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas. That this corresponded to some extent with social realities is evident from descriptions of priests and kings in other textual traditions. Kings are almost invariably depicted as wealthy, priests are also generally shown to be rich, though there are occasional depictions of the poor Brahmana. At another level, even as the Brahmanical view of society was codified in the Dharma Shastras and Dharma Shastras, other traditions developed critiques of the Varna order. Some of the best known of these were developed within early Buddhism, 6th century BC onwards. See also chapter 4. The Buddhists recognized that there were differences in society but did not regard these as natural or inflexible. They also rejected the idea of claims to status on the basis of birth. The wealthy Shudra, the story based on a Buddhist text in Pali known as the Majjhima Nikaya, is part of a dialogue between a king named Avantiputta and a disciple of the Buddha named Kachana. While it may not be literally true, it reveals Buddhist attitudes towards Varna. Avantiputta asked Kachana what he thought about Brahmanas who held that they were the best caste and that all other castes were low. The Brahmanas were a fair caste while all other castes were dark, that only Brahmanas were pure, not non Brahmanas, that Brahmanas were sons of a Brahma, born of his mouth, born of Brahma, formed by Brahma, heirs to Brahma. Kachana replied, what if a Shudras were wealthy, would another Shudras or a Kshatriyas or a Brahmana or a Vaishya speak politely to him? Avantiputta replied that if a Shudra had wealth or corn or gold or silver, he could have as his obedient servant another Shudra to get up earlier than he, to go to rest later, to carry out his orders, to speak politely, or he could even have a Kshatriya or a Brahmana or a Vaishya as his obedient servant. Kachana asked, this being so, are not these four Varnas exactly the same? Avantiputta considered that there was no difference amongst the Varnas on his count. Read Avantiputta's first statement again. What are the ideas in it that are derived from Brahmanical traditions? Can you identify the source of any of these? What, according to this text, explains social differences? An alternative social scenario, sharing wealth. So far, we have been examining situations where people either claimed or were assigned status on the basis of their wealth. However, there were other possibilities as well, situations where men who were generous were respected, while those who were miserable or simply accumulated wealth for themselves were despised. One area where these values were cherished, cherished was ancient Tamilikam, where, as we saw earlier, chapter 2, there were several chiefdoms around 2000 years ago. Amongst other things, the chiefs were patrons of bards and poets who sang their praise. Poems included in the Tamil Sangam anthologies often illuminate social and economic relationships, suggesting that while there were differences between rich and poor, those who controlled resources were also expected to share them. Take a look at figure 3.7, a chief and his follower stone sculpture, Amravati, Andhra Pradesh, 2nd century CE. How has the sculptor shown the difference between the chief and his followers? Source 14, the poor generous chief. In this composition from the Puranaruru, one of the anthologies of poems of the Tamil Sangam literature, 1st century, a bard describes his patron to other poets thus: he, that is the patron, doesn't have the wealth to lavish on others every day, nor does he have the pettiness to say that he has nothing and so refuse. He lives in Irante, a place, and is generous. He is an enemy to the hunger of bards. If you wish to cure your poverty, come along with me. Bards whose lips are so skilled. If we request him, showing him our ribs thin with hunger, he will go to the blacksmith of his village and will say to that man of powerful hands, shape me a long spear for war, one that has a straight blade. What are the strategies which the bird uses to try and persuade the chief to be generous? What is the chief expected to do? Acquire wealth in order to give some to the birds. Discuss. How do social relationships operate in present day societies? Are there any similarities or differences with the patterns of the past? Explaining social differences, a social contract. The Buddhists also developed an alternative understanding of social inequalities and of the institutions required to regulate social conflict in a myth found in a text known as the Sutta Pitaka. Sutta Pitaka, they suggested that originally human beings did not have fully evolved bodily forms, nor was the world of plants fully developed. All beings lived in an idyllic state of peace, taking from nature only what they needed for each meal. However, there was a gradual deterioration of the state as human beings became increasingly greedy, vindictive, and deceitful. This led them to wonder, what if we were to select a certain being who should be wrathful when indignation is right? Who should censure that which should rightly be censored, and should banish him who deserves to be banished? We will give him in return a proportion of the rice chosen by the whole people. He will be known as Mahasamanta, the great elect. This suggests that the institutions of kingship was based on human choice, with taxes as a form of payment for services rendered by the king. At the same time, it reveals recognition of human agency in creating and institutionalizing economic and social relations. There are other implications as well. For instance, if human beings were responsible for the creation of the system, they could also change it in future. Handling text, historians and the Mahabharata. If you look through the sources cited in this chapter, once more you will notice that historians considered several elements when they analyzed text. They examined whether texts were written in Prakrita, Pali, or Tamil, languages that were probably used by ordinary people, or in Sanskrit, a language meant almost exclusively for priests and elites. They also considered the kinds of text were these mantras lent and chanted by ritual specialists, or stories that people could have read or heard and then retold if they found them interestingly. Besides, then try to find out about the others whose perspectives and ideas shaped the text as well as the intended audience, as very often authors kept the interests of their audience in mind while composing their work, and they try and ascertain the possible date of the composition or complication of the text as well as the place where they may have been composed. It is only after making these assessments that they draw on the conflict of content of text to arrive at an understanding of their historical significance. As you can imagine, this is a particularly difficult task for a text as complex as the Mahabharata. Language and content. Let us look at the language of the text. The version of the Mahabharata we have been considering is in Sanskrit, although there are versions in other languages as well. However, the Sanskrit used in the Mahabharata is far simpler than that of the Vedas or of the Prashastis discussed in chapter 2. As such, it was probably widely understood. Historians usually classify the contents of the present text under two broad heads: sections that contain stories designated as the narrative, and sections that contain prescriptions about social norms designated as a didactic. This division is by no means watertight. The didactic sections include stories, and the narrative often contains a social message. However, generally historians agree that the Mahabharata was meant to be a dramatic, moving story, and that the didactic portions were probably added later. Didactic refers to something that is meant for purposes of instruction. Take a look at figure 3.8. Krishna advises Arjuna on the battlefield. This painting dates to the 18th century. Perhaps the most important didactic section of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, which contains the advice offered by Lord Krishna to Arjuna. The scene is frequently depicted in painting and sculpture. Take a look at figure 3.9. Lord Ganesha, the scribe. According to tradition, Vyasa dictated the text to the deity. This illustration is from a Persian translation of the Mahabharata. Interestingly, the text is described as an itihasa within early Sanskrit tradition. The literal meaning of the term is thus it was, which is why it is generally translated as history. Was there a real war that was remembered in the epic? We are not sure. Some historians think that a memory of an actual conflict amongst kinfolk was preserved in the narrative. Others point out that there is no other corroborative evidence of the battle. Authors and dates. Who wrote the text? This is a question to which there are several answers. The original story was probably composed by chartir bards known as the Sutas, who generally accompanied Kshatriya warriors to the battlefield and composed poems celebrating their victories and other achievements. These compositions circulated orally. Then, from the 5th century BCE, Brahmanas took over the story and began to commit it to writing. This was the time when chiefdoms such as those of the Kurus and Panchalas, around whom the story of the epic revolves, were gradually becoming kingdoms. Did the new kings want their itihasa to be recorded and preserved more systematically? It is also possible that the upheavals that often accompanied the establishment of these states, where old social values were often replaced by new norms, are reflected in some parts of the story. We notice another phase in the composition of the text between 200 BC and 200 CE. This was the period when the worship of Vishnu was growing in importance, and Krishna, one of the important figures of the epic, was coming to be identified with Vishnu. Subsequently, between 200 and 400 CE, large didactic, di- didactic sections resembling the Manusmriti were added. With these additions, a text which to comprise about 1 lakh verses. This enormous composition is traditionally attributed to a sage named Vyasa. The search for convergence. The Mahabharata, like any major epic, contains vivid descriptions of battles, forests, palaces, and settlements. In 1951 to 52, the archaeologist B.B. Lal excavated at a village named Hastinapura in Meerut, Uttar Pradesh. Was this the Hastinapura of the epic? While the similarity in names could be coincidental, the location of the site in the upper Ganga Doab, where the Kuru kingdom was situated, suggests that it may have been the capital of the Kurus mentioned in the text. Lal found evidence of 5 occupational levels, of which the second and third are of interest to us. This is what Lal noted about the houses in the second phase, 12th 7th centuries BC. Within the limited area excavated, no definite plans of houses were obtained, but walls of mud and mud bricks were duly encountered. The discovery of a mud plaster with prominent reed marks suggested that some of the houses had reed walls plastered over with mud. For the third phase, 6th 3rd century BCE, he noted houses of this period were built of mud brick as well as burnt bricks. Socket jars and brick drawings were used for draining out refuse water, while terracotta ring wells may have been used both as wells and drainage pits. Drainage pits was the description of the city in the epic added after the main narrative had been composed. When in the region, or was it a flight of poetic fancy which cannot always be verified by comparisons with other kinds of evidence? Consider another instance. One of the most challenging episodes in the Mahabharata is Draupadi's marriage with the Pandavas, an instance of polandry that is central to the narrative. If we examine the section of the epic that describes this event, it is evident that the authors attempted to explain it in a variety of ways. Hastinapura. This is how the city is described in the Adi Parvan of the Mahabharata. The city bursting like the ocean, packed with hundreds of mansions displayed with its gateways, arches, and turrets like massing clouds, the splendor of great Indra's city. Do you think Lars find match the description of Hastinapura in the epic? Take a look at figure 3.10, a wall excavated at Hastinapura. Draupadi's marriage. Drupada, the king of Panchala, organized a competition where the challenge was to string a bow and hit a target. The winner would be chosen to marry his daughter Draupadi. Arjuna was victorious and was garlanded by Draupadi. The Pandavas returned with her to their mother Kunti, who, even before she saw them, asked them to share whatever they had got. She realized her mistake when she saw Draupadi, but her command could not be violated. After much deliberation, Yudhishthira decided that Draupadi would be their common wife. When, Drau- when Drupada was told about this, he protested. However, the seer Vyasa arrived and told him that the Pandavas were in reality incarnations of Indra, whose wife had been reborn as Draupadi, and they were thus destined for each other. Vyasa added that in other instances a young woman had prayed to Shiva for a husband, and in her enthusiasm had prayed 5 times instead of once. This woman was now reborn as Draupadi, and Shiva had fulfilled her prayers. Convinced by these stories, Drupada consented to the marriage. Why do you think the authors offered three explanations for a single episode? Present day historians suggest that the fact that the authors describe a polyandrous union indicates that polyandry may have been prevalent amongst ruling elites at some point of time. At the same time, the fact that so many different explanations are offered for the episode, source 16 suggested that polyandry gradually fell into disfavor amongst the Brahmanas who reworked and developed the text through the centuries. Some historians note that while the practice of polyandry may have seemed unusual or even undesirable from the Brahmanical point of view, it was and is prevalent in the Himalaya region. Others suggest that there may have been a shortage of human during times of warfare, and this led to polyandry. In other words, it was attributed to a situation of crisis. Some early sources suggest that polyandry was not the only or even the most prevalent form of marriage. When then did the author choose to associate this practice with the central characters of the Mahabharata? We need to remember that creative literature often has its own narrative requirements and does not always literally reflect social realities. A dynamic test. The growth of the Mahabharata did not stop with the Sanskrit version. Over the centuries, versions of the epic were written in a variety of languages through an ongoing process of dialogue between peoples, communities, and those who wrote the text. Several stories that originated in specific regions or circulated among a certain people found their way into the epic. At the same time, the central story of the epic was often retold in different ways, and episodes were depicted in sculpture and painting. They also provided themes for a wide range of performing arts, plays, dance, and other kinds of narrations. Discuss. Read the excerpts from the Mahabharata included in this chapter once more. For each of these, discuss whether they could have been literally true. What do these excerpts tell us about those who composed the text? What do they tell us about those who must have read or heard the epic? Most retellings or reenactments of the epic draw on the main narrative in creative ways. Let us look at one example, an episode from the Mahabharata that has been transformed by Mahashweta Devi, a contemporary Bengali writer known for raising her voice against all forms of explanation, and operation. In this particular instance, she works out alternative possibilities from the main story of the Mahabharata and draw attention to questions on which the Sanskrit text is silent. The Sanskrit text describes how Duryodhana plotted to kill the Pandavas by inviting them to stay in a specially prepared house of lac, which he planned to set on fire. Forewarned, the Pandavas dug a tunnel to ensure their escape. Then Kunti arranged for a feast. While most of the invitees were Brahmanas, a Nishada woman came with her 5 sons. When they were satiated with drink and fell off to sleep, the Pandavas escaped, setting fire to the house. When the bodies of the woman and her sons were discovered, people thought that the Pandavas were dead. In her short story titled Kunti O Nishadi, Mahasweta Devi takes up the narrative from where the Mahabharata ends it. She sets the story in a forest where Kunti retires after the war. Kunti now has time to reflect on her past and often confesses to what she regards as her failings. Taking with the earth, the symbol of nature, every day she sees the Nishadas who come to collect wood, honey, tubers, and roots. One Nishadi, a Nishada woman, often listens to Kunti when she talks with the earth. One day there was something in the air. The animals were fleeing the forest. Kunti noticed that the Nishadi was watching her and was startled when she spoke to her and asked if she remembered the house of luck. Yes, Kunti said she did. Did she remember a certain elderly Nishadi and her 5 young sons, and that she had served them wine till they were senseless, while she escaped with her own sons? That Nishadi, not you, Kunti exclaimed. The Nishadi replied that the woman who was killed had been her mother in law. She added that while Kunti had been reflecting on her past, not once did she remember the 6 innocent lives that were lost because she had wanted to save herself and her sons. As they spoke, the flames drew nearer. The Nishadi escaped to safety, but Kunti remained where she was. Timeline 1, Major textual traditions 500 BCE, Astadhyayi of Panini, a worker on Sanskrit grammarian. 500 to 200 BC, major Dharmasutras in Sanskrit. 500 to 100 BC, early Buddhist texts including the Tripitaka in Pali. 500 BCE to 400 CE, Ramayana and Mahabharata in Sanskrit. 200 BCE to 200 CE, Manusmriti in Sanskrit composition and complication of Tamil Sangam literature. 100 CE, Charakanda, Sushruta, Samhitas, works on medicine in Sanskrit. 200 CE onwards, complication of the Puranas in Sanskrit. 300 CE, Natya Shastra of Bharata, a work on dramaturgy in Sanskrit. 300 to 600 CE, other Dharma Shastras in Sanskrit. 400 to 500 CE, Sanskrit plays including the works of Kalidasa, works on astronomy and mathematician by Aryabhatta and Varaha Mihra in Sanskrit, complication of Jaina works in Prakrit. Timeline 2, major landmarks in the study of the Mahabharata. 12th century, 1919 to 66, preparation and publication of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. 1973, J.A.B. Vaughan Boytain begins English translation of the critical edition, remains incomplete after his death in 1978. Answer in 100 to 150 words. Question number 1. Explain why patrilineal may have been particularly important among elite families. Question number 2. Discuss whether kings in early states were invariably Kshatriyas. Question number 3. Compare and contrast the dharma or norms mentioned in the stories of Drona, Hidimba, and Matanga. Question number 4. In what ways was the Buddhist theory of a social contract different from the Brahmanical view of society derived from the Purusha Sukta? Question number 5. The following is an excerpt from the Mahabharata in which Yudhishthira, the eldest Pandava, speaks to Sanjaya, a messenger. Sanjaya, convey my respectful greetings to all the Brahmanas and the chief priest of the house of Dhritarashtra. I bow respectful to teacher Drona. I hold the feet of our preceptor Kripa and the chiefs of the Kurus, the great Bhishma. I bow respectfully to the old king Dhritarashtra. I greet and ask after the health of his son Duryodhana and his younger brother. Also greet all the young Kuru warriors who are our brothers, sons and grandsons. Great above all him who is to us like father and mother, the wise Vidura, born of a slave woman. I bow to the elderly ladies who are known as our mothers. To those who are our wives, you say this. I hope they are well protected. Our doctors in law, born of good families and mothers of children, greet on my behalf. Embrace for me those who are our doctors, the beautiful, fragrant, well dressed courtesans of ours. You should also greet. Greet the slave women and their children. Greet the aged, the maimed, and the helpless. Try and identify the criteria used to make this list in terms of age, gender, kinship, ties. Are there any other criteria for each category? Explain why they are placed in a particular position in the list. Write a short essay about 500 words on the following. Question number 6. This is what a famous historian of Indian literature, Merrick Winternich, wrote about the Mahabharata. Just because the Mahabharata represents more of an entire literature and contains so much and so many kinds of things, it gives us an insight into the most profound depths of the soul of the Indian folk. Discuss. Question number 7. Discuss whether the Mahabharata could have been the work of a single author. Question number 8. How important were gender differences in early societies? Give reasons for your answer. Question number 9. Discuss the evidence that suggests that Brahmanical prescriptions about kinship and marriage were not universally followed. Map work. Question number 10. Compare the map in this chapter with map 1 and chapter 2. List the Mahajanapadas and cities located near the Kuru Panchala's lands. Project anyone. Question number 11. Find out about retellings of the Mahabharata in other languages. Discuss how they handle any two of the episodes of the text described in this chapter, explaining any similarities or differences that you notice. Question number 12. Imagine that you are an author and rewrite the story of Ekalavya from a perspective of your choice. Thank you.